The queen, in anger, cast him a die in quicksands. Hours later, he drank whiskey in a tavern. The planet of Zitherus was a jewel of the galaxy, a world of shimmering silver oceans and towering crystalline spires that pierced the heavens. It was ruled by the iron fist of Queen Seraphis, a monarch as beautiful as she was ruthless. Her court was a place of intrigue, where whispers of betrayal echoed through the halls, and loyalty was a currency more valuable than gold. But even in this world of advanced technology and interstellar travel, some traditions remained unchanged, like the execution of traitors. And so, it was on this day that Captain Yerrick Valen, once the Queen's most trusted commander, found himself standing before her throne, his hands bound in magnetic cuffs. The charges were clear: treason, conspiracy, and the attempted assassination of the Queen herself. The evidence was damning, though Yerrick swore his innocence. But in the court of Queen Seraphis, guilt was often a matter of perception. Yerrick Valen, the Queen's voice rang out, cold and unyielding. You have betrayed the crown and the people of Zitherus. For your crimes, you are sentenced to death. May the quicksands of the obsidian wastes claim you, and may your name be erased from history. The crowd murmured, a mix of fear and satisfaction. The obsidian wastes were a desolate region of Zitherus, a place where the ground itself seemed alive, swallowing anything that dared to tread upon it. The quicksands were a death sentence, slow and inevitable. Yerrick said nothing as the guards dragged him away. His eyes met the Queen's for a brief moment, and in that gaze there was no fear, only defiance. He was a man who had faced death 100 times before, and he would face it again with the same stoic resolve. The journey to the obsidian wastes was a silent one. The guards, clad in their sleek black armor, said nothing as they marched Yerrick across the barren landscape. The air was thick with the scent of sulfur, and the ground beneath their feet was a patchwork of black sand and jagged obsidian shards. In the distance, the quicksands shimmered like a mirage, their surface deceptively calm. When they reached the edge of the quicksands, the guards shoved Yerrick forward. He stumbled, his boots sinking into the soft, shifting ground. The guards watched as he struggled, their faces impassive. They had seen this before, and they knew how it would end. But Yerrick was not like the others. As the quicksands began to pull him under, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small device, a temporal displacer, a piece of forbidden technology that he had smuggled out of the Queen's own vault. With a flick of his wrist, he activated it, and the world around him dissolved into a blur of light and sound. When Yerrick opened his eyes, he was no longer in the obsidian wastes. He was standing in the middle of a bustling city, the air filled with the hum of hovercraft and the chatter of 1,000 voices. The buildings around him were a mix of ancient stone and gleaming metal, a testament to the planet's long history. He was in the heart of Zitherus capital, a place he knew well. But something was different. The people around him were dressed in clothing that seemed out of place, and the technology was older. Yerrick realized with a start that the temporal displacer had not only moved him through space, but through time as well. He was in the past, decades before the reign of Queen Seraphis. A grin spread across his face. If he was going to die, he might as well make the most of it. He made his way to a nearby tavern, a place he remembered from his youth. The sign above the door read the Silver Star, and the smell of whiskey and roasted meat wafted out into the street. Inside, the tavern was alive with activity. Patrons laughed and shouted, their voices rising above the clink of glasses and the strum of a lute. Yerrick made his way to the bar and ordered a glass of whiskey, the finest they had. As he drank, he couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. Here he was, a man who had been sentenced to die, drinking whiskey in a tavern that hadn't existed in his time for years. But his laughter was short-lived. As he sat there, nursing his drink, he overheard a conversation that made his blood run cold. "Did you hear?" One man said to another. "The queen's been assassinated." Yerrick froze. The queen? But Seraphis was still alive in his time. How could she have been assassinated in the past? Unless... His mind raced. If the queen had been assassinated in the past, it would change everything. The timeline would be altered, and the future he knew would cease to exist. But more importantly, it would mean that someone else had been behind the assassination attempt. Not him. Yerrick slammed his glass down on the bar and stood up. He had to find out who was responsible. If he could stop the assassination, he could clear his name and change the course of history. The next few days were a blur. Yerrick used his knowledge of the future to navigate the past, gathering information and piecing together the clues. He discovered that the assassination plot was the work of a shadowy organization known as the Crimson Hand, a group of rebels who sought to overthrow the monarchy and seize control of Zithris. But there was more to it than that. The Crimson Hand was not just a group of rebels. They were time travelers like him. They had come from the future to change the past, to ensure their own rise to power. And they had framed Yerrick for their crimes, knowing that he would be executed and unable to stop them. Yerrick knew what he had to do. He had to stop the Crimson Hand, not just to clear his name, but to protect the future of Zithris. He tracked them to their hideout, a crumbling fortress on the outskirts of the city. The battle was fierce, but Yerrick was a seasoned warrior, and he fought with the fury of a man who had nothing left to lose. In the end, he emerged victorious. The leaders of the Crimson Hand lay dead at his feet, their plans in ruins. But as he stood there, breathing heavily, he realized that his work was not yet done. He had to return to his own time, to ensure that the future he had fought for would come to pass. Using the temporal displacer once more, Yerrick traveled back to the present. When he arrived, he found that the timeline had indeed been altered. Queen Seraphis was still alive, and the Crimson Hand had never risen to power. But there was one final surprise waiting for him. As he made his way to the palace, he was greeted by the queen herself. She looked at him with a mixture of surprise and admiration. "Yerrick Valen," she said, her voice softer than he had ever heard it. "You have done what no one else could. You have saved Zithris." Yerrick bowed his head. "I only did what I had to do, Your Majesty." The queen stepped forward and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You are a hero, Yerrick, and you have my gratitude." Yerrick smiled. It was a strange feeling to be hailed as a hero after being condemned as a traitor. But he knew that he had earned it. He had faced death, traveled through time, and fought to protect the future. And now, as he stood there in the palace, he knew that he had finally found redemption. The queen's court was once again a place of intrigue, but this time, Yerrick Valen stood at her side, not as a prisoner, but as a trusted advisor. The obsidian wastes remained a place of fear, but for Yerrick, they were a reminder of how far he had come. And as he raised a glass of whiskey in the tavern that night, he knew that he had truly earned his place in history.